Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and in this project, we are going to create a calculator that determines if you're eligible to compete in UMA activities, right? So we have certain eligibility requirements, that need to be met so that you can compete. So first, we need to put some comments here. So Mr. Storm, and then we'll put the name of the calculator. Eligibility calculator. All right. And we need to start getting some information from our user. So there are 3 eligibility requirements that we're going to check for. First, we're going to check to see if you're a student at UMA. If you're not a student, you can't compete. Next, we're going to check whether or not you have no more than 1 F. Right? So you're allowed to be failing 1 class, anything more, or any, 2 or more, and you cannot compete. So we're going to check for that. Then we're also going to check for your GPA. So let's grab the first one here. So to check to see if you're a student, let's just say student. We'll create a new variable called student, and we'll say input. Do you go to UMA? All right. And that's just going to take whatever they type, and it's going to put it into the input or into the student variable. Next, let's check to see how many classes they're failing. So we're going to create a fail variable, and we'll say input. How many classes are you failing? Now, there's an issue here. Input will bring it in as a string. Basically, a string is just a bunch of alphanumeric characters. It's basically text. But we need to do a numerical comparison for this because we're going to check how many. And a number is different than a string. So what we need to do is we need to turn it into a string or into an integer so that we can use it properly. So we're going to wrap this whole thing in parentheses and put the int keyword in front of it. Turn it into an integer. All right. And then the last variable we need, we'll call it GPA. And we're going to do the same thing here, but instead of integer, we're going to use float. All right. So float is a floating point number. Basically, it's a number that can have a decimal, and GPAs have decimals, right? 3.2, 4.0, right? And so we're going to check their GPA using a decimal. So we'll say float input. What is your GPA? Okay. All right. So now we've captured all of the variables. Now we need to compare those variables to the eligibility requirements to see if that person can compete. So let's do the first one. So let's check to see if they're a student at UMA. So we can say if student equals, and we need 2 equal signs to make the comparison. If student equals yes. All right. Now notice that my cursor is now indented. That means that anything that I write is going to be inside of this if student equals yes, right? So in there we could say, you're a student or whatever. But we also want to check for, if they're not a student. So let's just put a statement in here. Let's say print, you are a student at UMA. Now we'll say else, meaning if they're not a student, then we want to print you don't even go to UMA. How are you going to compete? So basically what we've just done here is we've said if whatever they've answered up here equals the word yes, Y-E-S, then we're going to say, oh, you're a student at UMA. If not, then we're going to say you don't even go to UMA. How are you going to compete? So let's run it and make sure that that part works. Do you go to UMA? Yes. How many classes are you failing? 7. What is your GPA? 1.0. So it says you are a student at UMA, right? So that works because I checked for yes. Let's run it again and let's throw in no. No. No classes, 0 GPA. So notice how we get something different here. It says you don't even go to UMA. How are you going to compete? That's because for this question, I entered no instead of yes, right? So that's how that statement is supposed to work. Now you might be thinking, okay, so let's do the same thing for these other two. Let's just put them down here. And we could do that, but there's a much cleaner way to do it. We can add more if statements inside of an if statement. This is a concept called nesting. So inside this if statement, so if the student is, or if you are a student of UMA, then we can check to see if, for example, you're failing, less than 2 classes, or check to see if your GPA is a 2.0 or higher. And we can actually do that in the same line. So we're going to create a new if statement. Now, again, remember, pay attention to the indentation, right? So it's indented in by 1, which means it's inside of this if statement as well. So this if statement is only going to run if this if statement comes back as true, okay? So we want to make sure we're paying attention to indentation. So we'll say if fail is less than 2. So basically if you're failing fewer than 2 classes, and we can use our and keyword to check both conditions. We can say and GPA is greater than 2.0. So doing that, we're actually checking both conditions. And because we use the and keyword, both of these need to be true in order for this code to run, right? So we can say print, you are eligible to, I know I'm spelling eligible wrong. Hold on one second. This is going to bug me if I don't check it. Eligible. No, I'm spelling it correct. Okay, cool. Never mind. Ignore that. You are eligible to compete. So that means they've met all the conditions, right? They are a student. They're failing fewer than 2 classes, and their GPA is higher than a 2.0. But else, meaning they are a student, but one of these conditions aren't met. Maybe they're failing more than 1 class, or their GPA is too low. Print, you need to work on your grades. Okay. So that is essentially our whole program, right? So the logic of this program is basically this. If they are a student at UMA, then we tell them you're a student, and we check to see if they are failing less, or they're failing less than 2 classes, and their GPA is higher than 2.0. If that's true, then we tell them you're eligible to compete. If this statement is not true, then we tell them you need to work on your grades. If they're not a student, however, we tell them you don't even go to UMA, right? So in these couple lines, we've been able to really determine a lot of things about the user. We've been able to take in these 3 variables and then use them to compare to make sure that someone actually is eligible to compete. So let's go ahead and run it. Do you go to UMA? Yes. How many classes are you failing? 1. What's your GPA? 3.0. You are a student at UMA. You are eligible to compete. So, and we can even actually take this out because, or we can just make it more clear. We can say print, your grades are good. And then here we can say print, you are not eligible to compete. Right? So that way there's a little bit more information. So do you go to UMA? Yes. How many classes are you failing? I'm failing 4. What's your GPA? 3.1. You're a student at UMA. You need to work on your grades. You are not eligible to compete. So all of this is working now. And this program can be different depending on the situation, depending on the variables you enter. So this is a very easy way to use if statements to determine whether or not, or to make conditional determinations within your programs. We're going to use if-else statements a couple more times in this class, but it's really important you understand how this works. And indentation is incredibly important. Notice like these things that are inside of this if statement, they're indented twice because they're inside of this if statement and they're inside of that if statement, right? So pay attention to indentation, because if you screw up your indentation, it won't work. For example, if I do that, I'm going to get errors because it's confused about all this. This isn't indented inside the if, and so it's causing problems. So you want to make sure you're paying attention to your spaces, your indentation in Python. All right, perfect. That was fun. That was quick. Hopefully you found this easy. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.